Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here for the fifth and the final webcast in our series of initiatives for the Million Cat Challenge, Removing Barriers to Adoption, How Evidence, Innovation, and Compassion Grow Pet Adoptions. I'm Lynn Fridley, Program Manager for Maddie's Institute. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Cindy Delaney with the UC Davis Coret Shelter Medicine Program and Supervising Shelter Veterinarian for Yolo County Animal Services, where she has successfully implemented the 5 key initiatives of the Million Cat Challenge, including removing barriers to adoption. We also have Kelly Lee, Rescue and Behavior Coordinator, Yolo County SPCA's office at the Yolo County Animal Services, and she will join Dr. Delaney for the Q&A portion of this webcast. Before we start, let's talk about a few housekeeping items. Please take a look at the left side of your screen where you'll see a Q&A window. That's where you'll ask questions during the presentation. The presentation will be short, allowing more time for questions, but don't hold them until the end. Questions asked in the last few minutes will probably not be processed in time for a response. If you need help with your connection during the presentation, you can click the Help widget at the bottom of your screen. The green file widget contains the presentation handout and a printable certificate of attendance for people attending this live event. So be sure to download, save, and print. Thank you, Dr. Delaney for being here with us this evening.
All right. Yes, thank you, Lynn. So I'm very happy that you guys are all here. Lynn, do you have any further you wanted to say about the Maddie's Fund itself?
No, Dr. Delaney, we're ready for your presentation.
Okay, excellent. So I am Dr. Cindy Delaney, and I do work for the UC Davis Coret Shelter Medicine Program. And it's kind of an interesting and unique relationship that we have in that I work for UC Davis, but then I'm contracted out to work at the local animal shelter, which is Yolo County Animal Services. And that's a public animal shelter run by the local sheriff's department. I started in that position at the end of 2011. And since starting there, we've been able to begin a whole bunch of really good programs focused on improving outcomes for the animals. I have a little list of some of the programs we've started here, including removing barriers to adoption, fee specials and off-site adoption events, improving our population management, creating a kitten foster program, creating a community cats or SNR program, and also increasing our shelter spay-neuter capacity to keep up with all of those good new programs. Joining me tonight is going to be Kelly Lee, and Kelly works for the Yolo County SPCA. That's a private rescue group that's a foster-based organization. They don't have their own bricks and mortar shelter, but they work out of our shelter with 2 of their employees stationed at Yolo County Animal Services. And those 2 employees are responsible for a number of really important programs at the shelter, including helping with adoption, facilitation, and counseling, running the rescue transfer program, coordinating our lost and found program, helping with our community cats and barn cats program, and also doing a lot of behavior modification and training. And that's Kelly's primary role, is in behavior modification and training, and she also does a lot of the adoption counseling. So she's been with that organization for about 2.5 years now, so she's seen a lot of our new changes at the shelter and been a big part of them and a big part of our success. So basically, I wanted to kind of just start at the beginning. I started at the Yolo County Animal Services at the end of 2011, and the first thing I did at that shelter was kind of take a look around at how things were going, both looking around on the ground as I walked around the facility and worked there, but also sitting down at a computer and looking at the shelter's data. And when I started to look at the data, I saw that we didn't have as good of outcomes as we could, especially for cats. For dogs, we had a live release rate of around 80%, which was pretty darn good. But cats, our live release was stuck at around 30%. So not really very good. And when I started to do some analysis, I wanted to look at what was causing the deaths of the 70% of the cats that weren't making it out alive. So I basically ran a euthanasia risk analysis on the shelter's data. And what I saw was that the largest percentage of cats were being euthanized because they were feral, fearful, or timid. So out of the 1,700 cats euthanized in the previous year before I started there, almost 1,000 were euthanized for behavioral concerns. and about 500 were euthanized for being underage. So those were kittens. And looking at the data, really only about less than 300 were being euthanized for medical reasons. And as a vet, that's a little disheartening because I think, okay, I can focus on the medical, but if I'm just being a vet, it's hard to fight that behavioral and the underage euthanasia. So luckily, one of my roles at the shelter was also to do some of the shelter management duties because we didn't really have a shelter manager. And so when I looked at this and said, okay, 83% of our cats are being euthanized for non-medical, I realized that I really had to reach out and look beyond just being the shelter vet to help these cats. So we did start to implement some programs by looking at these kind of what I call low-hanging fruit cats, the ones that were most at risk of euthanasia and yet almost the easiest to help if we really focused on them versus something that's really, really sick and can't be fixed. Some of these things are actually quite fixable. So we started to put some programs in place, and this was mostly between 2012 and 2014. And this was also around the same time that the community cats movement was taking hold, and people were starting to really look to that as a solution for decreasing euthanasia rates. And I am lucky that I work with Dr. Kate Hurley, who is one of the forerunners, along with Dr. Levy, of this movement. And they were also creating the Million Cat Challenge around this time. And so as we started to put programs in place, we found that actually we were putting programs in place in areas that each of the 5 key initiatives would end up covering. So we have ended up putting in place programs in each of these areas: alternatives to intake, managed admission, capacity for care, removing barriers to adoption, and return to field. And so over that approximately 2-year period, as a result of these programs, we've seen that our cat euthanasia rate has gone from approximately 70% to about 10%. And our kittens have done even better than our adult cats in some respects. Their current live release rate is approximately 92%. So just a quick timeline of what this all looked like, because looking back at it, a whole lot of things happened kind of quickly. So in 2010 and 11, our euthanasia rate was around 70%. We then started doing a lot of this maximizing adoptions. We started doing adoption fee reductions. And more importantly, we started looking towards a more open adoption process, which is what we're going to talk about a bit tonight. We also partnered with a rescue group to start a kitten foster program because the shelter had not really done that before. We started doing off-site kitten adoptions. We eventually phased out field pickup of cats, and then we started our SMR, or Community Cats program. And we eventually expanded some more programs by taking our kitten fostering internally so we didn't have to rely on the rescue group. And we started expanding a barn cat program for cats that weren't available to go through our SNR program because they couldn't go back where they came from. And at the end of that period of time where we put all these programs in place, we had a really good result to the point where our euthanasia rate had dropped to approximately 10% for cats. In addition to our euthanasia rate going down, we had all kinds of other good things happen, which really weren't all that obvious at the time, but when I look back at the numbers, it became very clear. So overall, our cat intakes went down. Our average daily population of cats went down. Our euthanasia rate, of course, dropped. Our length of stay for cats also dropped. And at the same time, our adoption rate went up, and our live release rate, of course, went up correspondingly. And so I'm just going to go through some of the numbers quickly so you can see this visually, because when I ran the numbers and looked at these charts, it was kind of fun and impressive. So this chart shows our cat intakes, and you can see that they went from approximately 2,600 a year down to between 1,600 and 1,800. We've actually seen a small uptick in intakes, and unfortunately we're victims of our own success. So as people hear that our live release rate has gone up, we're starting to see more people preferentially coming to our shelter so that the animal has a better chance of survival. We've seen a general decrease in intake, which is very nice for us. I did look at dogs at the same time, even though I'm not going to show you all of their stats. But basically, dog intake has not changed, and that's because we haven't done any significant programs. So I really do feel like our changes for the cats are due to our programs that we put in place over the past 2 years, because we haven't seen the same scope of changes for the dogs. Looking at our average daily population, so the number of cats on site at our shelter, we've seen this drastic decrease from approximately 70 cats on site each day at the shelter to less than 38 as of the most recent numbers. So that's really good. That means less work, less stress for the cats. just a bunch of good stuff when you can decrease your average daily population. Looking at our euthanasia rate, you see this drastic drop from 72% euthanasia down to approximately 10%. And that's been just wonderful for us to see on the ground at the shelter. Looking at the number of cats euthanized, we were euthanizing approximately 1,800 cats, and now we're euthanizing less than 200 each year over the past 2 years. And that, we feel that. We feel that every day, that we're not euthanizing 5 to 10 cats a day the way we used to have to. This was another, not completely unexpected, but fun to see change, is that our average length of stay has gone down. And that's gone down for every single outcome type. It's gone down most drastically for adoption, but for everything, we're getting the cats into the shelter and out of them more quickly so that they're not spending as much time in our shelter system, which again is really better for everybody. So our average length of stay overall has gone down from 13.9 days down to 5.7 days, which is really pretty astounding when you think about it. And when we look at our outcomes for our cats, one of the most improved outcomes is adoption. We used to see only a very small portion of our cats being adopted. That's the kind of bright green color. And now in our most recent calendar year, you see that that green has just grown by leaps and bounds. You also see that that brown area starts to take effect, and that's our Community Cats program. We call that our YCC release for YOLO Community Cats. And you can see that that's made a drastic change in the number of live outcomes for our cats. And so this is just a summary of all of that data to show that basically every single parameter that I would want to look at for our cats has improved over this period of time. Our live release rate has gone up by 193%. Live release numbers gone up by 104%. Euthanasia rate gone down by 84%. Euthanasia numbers gone down by 90%. Intake numbers have gone down by 36%. And even our DOAs, we had people who said, when you do these programs, aren't you just going to have more cats out on the street getting killed? And that's actually not happened at all. Our dead on arrival cats has gone down by 32%, even with all of our return to field activities. Our length of stay has gone down by 67%, and our average daily population of cats has gone down by 44%. So all of those parameters have just shown drastic improvements. And one of the major areas that we saw improvement was in cat adoptions. Looking back at 2009 and 10, we had approximately 260 cats per year being adopted, and now we have more than 500 per year. And so not only have we more than doubled our number of cats being adopted, but at the same time we've decreased our intake. So the percent of cats adopted is even more of an increase. And that's been really great for us and for our community. Our average length of stay for cats, as we said, to adoptions has also gone down. It used to be kind of, I don't want to use the word horrific, but kind of horrific, 52 days, average length of stay to adoption. Think about that. That's each cat on average sitting in the shelter for almost 2 months, and now it's down to 10 days, which I'm very happy with. I think that's a great length of stay to adoption at our facility. So we're going to go ahead and do a quick poll question. I haven't so far shown you how we achieve this, but seeing the progress that we've had, go ahead and answer this poll question. Lynn, are you going to give this whole question, or should I read it out loud?
I'd like to remind the audience, though, before we do this poll question, is please get your questions in to Dr. Delaney and Kelly, and Dr. Levy is also with us tonight. So submit those questions. We're going to be reaching the end of our presentation shortly, and then it'll be time for your questions. All right, so after seeing the progress that Yolo County Animal Services has made, are you convinced that removing barriers to adoption can work in your local shelters? Yes, we already implemented this and it's working. Yes, we are convinced and we're looking forward to saving more animals. No, we're not convinced yet. Tell us more. No, this will not work in our community's shelters. Don't know or not applicable. So please answer on your screen, not in the Q&A window, and choose one of our answers. After seeing the progress at Yolo County, are you convinced that removing barriers to adoption can work in your local shelter? And I think Dr. Delaney's getting into the nuts and bolts of removing barriers to adoption as we go forward. So let's look at our results. Wow, that's interesting, Dr. Delaney. It looks like there's 39% of these folks they're convinced and they're looking forward to saving even more animal lives. And we have 11% of the people that you may be able to convince.
Okay, you 11%. Listen up. And you 2.2%. Let's talk. Let's talk a little bit more before you really make any decisions here. Because I think that a lot of people at our shelter were in that 2.2% before we got going. So here we go. So basically, as far as removing barriers to adoption, what we found was that of all the programs we had to put in place, SNR, TNR, foster kitten, this was really the only program that didn't cost money and didn't require more staff or supplies. Really, removing barriers to adoption for us was all about a shift in philosophy and changing our mindset, which is cheap and relatively easy compared to a lot of other programs that you might want to implement. So it's a really good one to contemplate and try and put in place because it doesn't require a lot of resources other than opening your mind and talking to your staff and your volunteers and changing your mind a little bit potentially. At our shelter and at every shelter, I'm sure, we love animals. We want them to have the best life possible. Unfortunately, when you work in a shelter, especially a public shelter or any shelter, you tend to see a lot of negative stuff. You often see animals who aren't well cared for. You might have people come in who aren't very nice or don't really seem to care about their animals. And we would see this at our front counter or out in the field, and it just impacted us. It gave us kind of a negative perception of people to some extent. And we wanted to kind of protect our animals from anything bad. And so we kind of had a negative mindset about the public sometimes, and we ended up making it really difficult for people to adopt, try and make sure that our animals got the best home possible. So with all good intentions, we ended up doing something that maybe wasn't all that good. And the thing we need to remember is, and this was pointed out to me, I went to the HSUS Expo and I heard an excellent presentation there about this topic. And we only see a very small portion of the owned animal population. They estimate when you look at owned animal numbers and the number of animals coming to shelters that we see less than 6% of owned animals coming through our shelters every year. For cats, we probably see even fewer owned cats, and maybe only 2 to 3% of the cats that come into our shelters we interact with every year and interact with an owner. The rest of the cats, we see 2 to 3% of all cats every year coming into our shelters that have an owner. The rest of the cats out there, the other 97, 98 or more percent, we don't see at our shelters, and we don't see their owners at our shelters because those people are at home taking care of their pets. We don't really see the vast majority of cat owners. We just see a small sample. And sometimes we see a negative sample. And unfortunately, our brains have what's called a negativity bias, which is that we remember things that are bad much more vividly than things that are good. And so, if you think back to your last really bad day, if you replayed a video of that day, probably a whole bunch of really good things happened, 97, 98 good things, and maybe 1 or 2 bad things. But at the end of the day, you came home and said, I had a bad day, because those negative things impact you so much more sometimes than good things. And that happens to us in the shelter. The really bad people and the really bad cases stick out for us a lot more than the good cases. And that was happening to us. We were seeing the public as bad and something that we had to protect our cats from. But that wasn't working for us. And what wasn't working was that only 11% of our cats and kittens were being adopted, and 70% of them were being euthanized. So we were protecting our cats and kittens to death. And we were saving them from a possible less than ideal home or life living outdoors as a free roaming cat so that we could 100% sure walk them into our euthanasia room and put them to sleep. And that's not really great logic, and that doesn't work for the cats. So what else was wrong? Our length of stay to adoption was very long. Our average on-site cat population was very high. And all of these things, our low adoption rate, our high euthanasia rate, our long length of stay, and our high average population was very bad for our cats, and it was bad for us. It was bad for the shelter. It was bad for the employees. It was bad for the public, bad for the department, just bad for our community as a whole. And I remember this striking me so strongly when I first started there. I started there in October, and because there was no kitten foster program, we didn't really have a bunch of kittens in the shelter left over from fostering. And so we didn't have any kittens. And after I'd been there a few weeks, a group of 3 kittens came in. And I got them on the surgery schedule right away, got them ready for adoption, put them up in adoption, and I was like, great, these kittens are going to fly off the shelf. They're going to be adopted right away. And I was completely optimistic. And I came in the next day, and the kittens were still there. I was like, okay, fine, takes a little bit of time. Came in the next day, kittens are still there. For 2 weeks, I came in every day, and these kittens were still there and had not been adopted. And finally, when I walked through the room, I saw an adopter meeting a kitten, falling in love, taking the paperwork up front. And when I came back a few hours later, the kitten was still there. And I asked people, I said, why is this kitten still here? I saw an adopter. Why is this kitten still at the shelter? And they said, oh, they got declined for adoption. I said, you must be kidding. I said, these kittens have been here for 2 weeks. There are no other kittens here. How could we possibly decline somebody? And what people started to tell me was that basically it was very difficult to adopt from our shelter, and that they themselves, volunteers and employees of our shelter, wouldn't be able to adopt because our policies were so stringent. And that seemed kind of, I don't want to use the word crazy, but I do, because it seemed crazy to me. And I don't like things that are crazy. They bother me. So when we started to look at our policies, this is some of the things that we used to do that were making it difficult to adopt. We required proof of home ownership, even if you were adopting a cat or a kitten. We would actually ask people to bring in their paid property tax bill. If they weren't homeowners, we did a landlord check. We required other pets to meet the new pets, mostly for dogs. We required all the family members to meet the new pet. And most importantly, and probably the biggest barrier, is that we had kind of an arduous adoption application. People had to fill it out and then go through a very personal interview where there was more judgment and negativity than I think was ideal. And it's all from good intentions, but maybe it wasn't accomplishing what we wanted it to. So people would answer our questions, and things that could be wrong or a red flag might be ages of people in the home. You know, young children might be a red flag. You know, all being young people in college might be a red flag. Other pets and other pets' medical and spay-neuter status might be a red flag. If they plan to have the cat as an outdoor cat, that might be a problem for us. If they wanted to declaw, that could be a red flag. If they had other pets that had bad outcomes that they told us about or that we knew about, that could be a red flag. And if they had other issues like working really long hours, that could be a red flag and lead to them not being able to adopt. So it was difficult, and there was a lot of judgment involved. Other things that we didn't do, but I've heard shelters do that might be something to rethink, would be requiring home visits, veterinary references, background checks, or a waiting period prior to adoption. These all create barriers to adoption that make it hard for people to adopt from you. And one of the reasons that I think this is important for us all to think is I have not always been the most perfect adoption applicant. I think all of us on this webinar are in like the top 1% of animal lovers. And yet, I bet that a lot of us possibly could be declined for adoption at certain shelters. So if we were all in one big room together, this would be more visual. But wherever you are, I would like you to stand up in your room. If you're driving, please do not stand up. But if you're in a room, stand up. And I want you to sit down if one of these things applies to you. So if you've ever kept a pet that a landlord didn't know about, I want you to sit down. And for the record, I've already sat down. If you had pets who lived together, even though they didn't really get along, I want you to sit down. If you ever let your pet's vaccines or other medical care lapse, I want you to sit down. If you've ever worked long hours outside of your home, I want you to sit down. If you've ever had young children in your home that might have negative interactions with a pet, please have a seat. If you lived in a home without a secure fenced yard, go ahead and sit down. If you've allowed a pet cat to live outdoors or go in and out at will, please sit down. And if you've owned more animals than were allowed by your city or county, sit down. And so in our little virtual room, I want you to look around. If you're still standing, congratulations. You can probably adopt from almost any shelter unless they don't like you on your home visit or something else comes up. But I would guess, this is just a guess, that approximately 90% of us or more have sat down, which means that of us, 1% of the best animal people in the world, only 10% of us would be allowed to adopt from many shelters. And that's not okay, and that's not right. And even though not everybody can meet all of these criteria, you can still be an awesome animal lover and an awesome animal owner. And that's really important for us to remember when we're going to adopt an animal out to somebody. And so we're going to go ahead and say a little prayer. Now we're going to say the serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. And you don't have to get a tattoo of this, but if this is an issue for you, you might want to consider it. Because one of the things we need to realize in shelters is that we can't control everything. We can't control whether or not people get pets. We can't control if people tell us the truth or not. We can't control what kind of pet owners people are going to be. And we can't control the universe. Because sometimes bad things happen to good people and their pets. And somebody may report something happened to their pet, and it's just not their fault. So that's what we can't control. But what can we control? We can control whether or not people are allowed to get pets from us and save their lives from the shelter. And remember, we're not the only game in town. There have been studies that have looked at this, and a 2012 study showed that only 26% of cats were acquired from shelters. And even more importantly, in low-income and underserved communities, approximately only 3% of pets are acquired from shelters. And there's an excellent new resource out there, the HSUS's new Adopters Welcome Book, which you can either get from them or download as a PDF, and I strongly recommend it because it talks about this quite a bit. But this is one of their graphics, and it shows that 26% of cats in this survey were acquired from shelters, and the vast majority were acquired elsewhere, as strays or from a friend or relative or another source. And again, even more importantly, animals being acquired by people in low-income and underserved communities, only this tiny percent, 3%, came from shelters. And this is our most at-risk population of pet owners. These are our pet owners that if we don't give them an animal that's already spayed and neutered and microchipped and vaccinated, they're the least likely to be able to seek those services on their own. And they're still going to get a pet. So you're not preventing them from getting an animal. You're just preventing them from getting an animal from you. They're still going to go get one. So what can we control if we help people get a cat from us? We can control whether the cat they get is already spayed and neutered, current on vaccines, and microchipped. And that's huge. That's how we're going to stem the tide, is by getting animals into people's homes that are already fixed, not going to reproduce. We can control whether people get some guidance and advice on selecting an appropriate pet. We can control whether people get education and advice how to introduce their new pet to their home and provide it with medical and behavior care and training. We can control whether people they need help to avoid their pet ending up back in the shelter in the future. And really, worst case, if we do get that pet back into the shelter, at least it's healthy and adoption ready if the adoption doesn't work out, so we can just put it back in another home right away. So what did we do at YOLO? What we did is we focused on open adoption. We focused on helping people to adopt rather than trying to prevent them from adopting. We still have the adoption application. We haven't phased that out because this is a slow process. But our goal now is to talk to the adopter, help them make the best adoption choice, and provide them with guidance and resources and advice about their new pet. Our goal is to be less judgmental, more helpful, and give them a positive experience and a great lifelong pet. And that also helps us with word of mouth if we have a positive experience for them. Other things we did besides just making it easier to adopt in the conversation part is that we made it easier physically. So we changed our adoption hours, days to make that easier. We increased the friendliness and got more volunteers to help with adoptions. We made discounted fees a norm for our shelter. Fees waived adoption, 2 for 1 on kittens, or 1 kitten with a free adult mentor cat. And we did this because a study has shown that there's no increase in return rates for animals adopted at reduced fees. We started allowing our volunteers to act as adoption counselors so we could have off-site adoption events because we hadn't been able to do that previously. We started advertising and promoting our animals. We stopped declining adoptions for pets as gifts. And we stopped putting special restrictions on animals adopted around the holidays. So things like black cats around Halloween were no longer an issue. And once our adoptions increased, there was a whole new world open to us. We could implement our kitten foster program because we knew we'd be able to adopt those kittens out when they got older, and previously that had been a big barrier. We started offering some cats for adoption that were a little more shy or cat reactive before they would have been euthanized. And now we're even starting to offer some of these special medical needs. We would have never considered this. Senior cats, cats with illnesses like hyperthyroidism, cats with FIV, we're starting to put them up for adoption. We're still managing our population, and we're making sure that we don't have a million slow track cats, and no fast trackers, but we're able to reach a little bit higher as far as our low-hanging fruit goes now that we have the adoption piece improved. And one of the questions I get is, will returns skyrocket if you implement these kinds of programs? And all I can say is they didn't for us. When I looked at our adoption return rate, this is what I saw. I saw that before these programs, it was approximately 1.9%, and then it stayed right around that rate, 2.4 in the last year, but 1.9 overall. So really, no kind of a skyrocket. Definitely not something we couldn't handle. And more importantly, even if returns did go up a little bit, that is not the end of the world. Even though I know it's hard when you see a cat come back as a return, you don't want to think about it as a failure. You just want to think about it as an opportunity to learn about that animal and to learn about the adopter and make a better match the next time. And if the adopter chooses to rehome the animal, that's also not the end of the world. That can still be a successful rehoming. So that's not necessarily a negative. Overall, our goals at our shelter, and I hope for you and your shelter or rescue group, is to be a resource for adoption, not a barrier to adoption. And remember what we want to accomplish. We want to save lives. We want to get pets into homes that are spayed or neutered, vaccinated, and microchipped, if that's your protocol. We want to educate people about pet ownership. We want to put our resources in other areas whenever possible by conserving them. Look into SNR programs, TNR programs, foster care programs, low-cost public spay-neuter, and we do that by minimizing our length of stay and minimizing our population on site while still maximizing our live release rates. So those are our big goals, and hopefully they're some of your goals too. And for me, when I'm looking at how we're doing in our shelter, I kind of have this cycle I go through. And I look at current outcomes, and I look for what's my current low-hanging fruit. You know, what's my next thing I'm going to reach for and try and fix? Then I set a goal around that piece. I look for any barriers. I overcome those barriers, and then I do it again. And I look for the next low-hanging fruit by looking at the new outcomes once we've gotten our new programs in place. And I think that's the way to go. I think in this industry, it's a constant reach. You have to see what's going on, analyze how you're doing today, and see what you need to reach for tomorrow. And this is where we've landed at YOLO, looking at our euthanasia risk analysis. Basically, this shows over the past 5-6 years the reasons that cats were euthanized at the shelter. The blue line that's the highest is being a feral cat, and that was very high, and now it's just not even a reason for euthanasia. Being too young was the next highest reason, and now that's not even really a reason. Being fearful just drops off in 2012. That's no longer a reason to be put to sleep at our shelter. And when you look at this in another format using a little table here, you can see that being feral is in 2014 no one's reason for euthanasia. Being too young was one kitten. Fearful, no one was euthanized for that. Now we're really looking at medical conditions, and these are severe medical conditions at our shelter. These are untreatable at our current level, but it's so much better than it used to be. And now as a vet, for me, I actually like being able to look at this and see, okay, the cats being euthanized at our shelter, 98% are being euthanized because they have a very horrible medical condition. And the ones that don't have a horrible medical condition are not being put to sleep. And I think that that's our goal. Our goal is to only euthanize the ones that we really, really, really cannot fix medically and are suffering, and let the rest go on and live a long and healthy life. So that's where we're at. We went from 83% euthanized for non-medical reasons to approximately 1% for non-medical. And I think that's a great accomplishment personally, and I'm very happy that our shelter was able to make that journey. And it's a constant journey and a constant struggle, and we're not perfect, but I feel like we've made great progress. So that is just about all that I have. At the very end here, we have some references and resources, and they're also in your handouts. But I think it's about time to go on to some questions.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dr. Delaney. And we do have a lot of questions that have come in during the webcast, so we'll take the first question here. How do you feel about written adoption applications? Are interviews better, or is there value in having people fill out information beyond name, address, and other basics?
You know, I'm going to give my personal opinion, and then maybe I'll go ahead and also throw that one over to Kelly and get her opinion on this. Personally, I like to have some kind of something in writing. just to get the conversation started. I feel like there are certain questions that if you can ask, it's a takeoff point to start your conversation rather than just being left open-ended. And there are some things that I do like to have documented. That's me personally, but I'm kind of a paper person. Kelly, are you there? Do you want to give your opinion on this one?
Yeah, I also like having the written adoption application. It makes sure that you cover some basic points, and we ask about what current animals they have, and it does help make sure that you don't forget to touch on anything important.
Great, thank you. We also have Dr. Julie Levy on with us tonight, and Dr. Levy, feel free to jump in if you have any opinions on these questions.
I, too, like to have a little bit of documentation on an application. You're going to have something to process just the transfer of ownership with, good contact information to get back to people later. And I do think that having a little bit of information just helps people think about their answers and provides for a starter conversation. But really, I am so much more happy with sit-down conversations, and we don't have wrong answers. We have answers that we can help people be better pet owners with. And in fact, if we think people are giving us wrong answers, we're really glad that they're in front of us because, as Dr. Delaney said, they are going to get a pet, but now they're going to get a pet that comes with some support and some education, and so it'll be a better arrangement for everybody.
Very good, excellent. Let's take the next question. Our shelter isn't very willing to allow volunteers to assist with adoptions. How important is it to allow volunteers to counsel adopters and assist with adoption processes?
So this is Dr. Delaney, and I feel pretty strongly about this. At the shelter where I'm at currently, there was a huge barrier to doing off-site adoption events. Getting our kittens basically was the original issue out into like the local pet store. And initially we had to kind of do an end run around that concern, and I had to pull them through my little rescue group and have my little volunteers do the off-site adoptions. And what happened was it was so extremely successful, and the kittens were flying off the shelves that we would have to go back to the shelter and reload. So we'd pull from the shelter as a rescue, take it to the event, and it would get adopted. And it was extremely successful, and the return rate on those animals was no different than the ones being adopted at the shelter. And so basically the proof was in the pudding for us, and we saw that you could really leverage yourself by allowing your volunteers to do some of this. And we gave them some training, and we asked them to use their common sense and their good judgment. And it was so successful that it spoke for itself. And I still think we could leverage this even more and use even more volunteers. For instance, I stole Kelly from the shelter tonight for this webinar, and there was a little bit of consternation about who would do adoption counseling if she wasn't at the shelter. And so it's another reach for us is to make sure that we do a little bit more training with volunteers at the shelter itself also. So I think it's very important. I think you're really a little bit stymied if you only have a couple of key adoption counselors, because if people go on vacation or they're sick, it can limit your adoptions, and that's unnecessary. And I remember, really sorry, I can't quote the study, but I remember a few years ago there was a study where people basically were allowed to adopt with absolutely no questions and no counseling during the study versus animals where the people were counseled and lots of questions. And between the two groups, no counseling and no questions asked, and the strong counseling, the return rate was the same. And so yeah, I think anything you can do to allow people to adopt is a good idea, and I think volunteers are crucial. Anybody else who wants to speak up, go for it. I didn't mean to monopolize.
Kelly, Dr. Levy?
Yeah, I agree. Most of us are really short-staffed, and having a limit on who can do adoptions can really cripple your ability to especially during specials or times where you're having a large volume of adoptions. If you're limited by just having one or two people doing adoptions, you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot. So we have several volunteers that do a great job. They know that they have several people on speed dial. If they have a concern, they can always refer the person to come back to the shelter on the next open day, but for fairly straightforward adoptions, there's no reason why they can't do a good job.
And I totally agree with that. You can train volunteers easily in a relatively short amount of time for routine adoption if you have a good, well-organized adoption process with good records that you're turning over. Sometimes it's a policy, especially in a government shelter, that only a staff member can handle the money. So you can take them up to the counter to pay at the end after they've had a nice, pleasant conversation with a trained adoption volunteer. And the adoption volunteers often have more information about the animals because they've actually been working with them in the kennels than the staff at the reception desk would have. And also the staff at the reception desk are frequently interrupted by other demands such as phone calls and information. So there really is no reason not to include volunteers in the process.
Okay, thank you all. Let's take the next question. And this is a good one. How did you manage opinions of shelter employees and volunteers who were against such progressive change in adoption policies?
Gosh, at the beginning it seemed really difficult. And like I said, this is maybe not ideal, but we kind of did an end run at the beginning to kind of go around the system and prove that it could work. And once it was successful, people started to support it. So as far as the offsite adoptions, that's how we started that. They saw how successful it was. Then everybody's like, this is really a good idea. The open adoptions, it was a process of talking and discussing and talking about people's concerns and, really just discussing the fact that even the adoption counselor themselves might not be allowed to adopt if we strictly went by how we were screening people. So it was really important that everybody kind of understand that we weren't doing our cats any service by euthanizing them if they had an option of a possible good outcome. And really it was very difficult to predict. And so it was a matter of discussing, it was a matter of putting our foot in the water. One thing that surprised us is the whole home ownership thing. We're not even sure who started that, but as soon as we said let's stop doing that, everybody agreed that it was not as smart as it might have been, and they agreed that it wasn't a good policy, and it was just something that had always been done. So in some cases, when you start actually exploring these topics, you find out that it's just a historical thing, and it's not really supported by anybody who's currently at the shelter, and then it's really easy to get rid of it. And some of the other things, it's a matter of talking. Sometimes it's a matter of, doing a little bit of a test. Let's try if we don't require this, and let's try it for a few months and see how things go. And if things go horribly, we'll redirect. And if things go great, then we'll go even stronger. And so it was a combination of things. It was a combination of really reviewing the current policies to make sure anybody still felt strongly about them, discussing things that didn't seem to be important, and then putting our foot in the water and trying to loosen things up just a little bit and seeing what results we got. The volunteers were pretty much all supportive from the start. We didn't have a ton of volunteers back then, but the ones who were there were very supportive because they wanted to see our animals get adopted. It was kind of more staff that we had to talk about just because it was a very strong culture of doing things a certain way. But once we got into it, the ball just gained momentum and people just really jumped on board, and it became really successful, and people seemed very pleased with it. And I didn't feel like we were rolling over people. People had just decided that it was right and they liked it better.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else have something on that question? If not, I've got a really good one for you here. Let's just go to that. My staff is worried that fee specials encourage people to adopt who cannot afford to care properly for the pet. How would you answer them?
Okay. Couple of things. So first of all, people who want a pet are going to get a pet regardless. And they can get a pet free off Craigslist or from their next door neighbor or from the street. So people who want a pet are going to get one whether or not they have a lot of money. You cannot stop them. But you can give them a pet that's already spayed and neutered and microchipped and vaccinated, which they will not get probably from their neighbor or off the street. And if they can't afford to get a pet from you, then definitely they can't afford to get that pet spayed and neutered and microchipped and vaccinated if they get it from another source and that's not already done. But that being said, more importantly, what I think we found is that the people who adopt during a fee special aren't destitute. Most of the time when we do a fee special, it's not really about the fee. It's about something to promote and something to tell the public about and something to remind them that we exist. And it's something to send a press release about that the press might actually pick up, and something to throw on our Facebook page, and something to put in a flyer and post all around town. And it's really not about the money, but that's a part of the excitement, is that, hey, we have this great, limited time adoption fee special, come in now and adopt. And so it's all of those things. You're not going to stop them from getting a pet anyway, and really the majority of people aren't there because they're destitute. They're there because you've excited them by reminding them that the shelter exists and that it has great animals who need great homes. So that's my personal opinion, again, Dr. Delaney. And you guys want to chime in? Do you have some other thoughts?
Kelly?
Yeah, I was just thinking about, we did some really drastic fee reductions in the last couple of years. We even had, some free or $5 Friday kind of events. And we really didn't see, although we do encourage adopters to contact us if they have any trouble of any kind, return the animal if they can't care for it. We really didn't have a big rush of returns or panicked calls. It is important to keep in mind that if you make this kind of policy change, if you do get one return or panicked call and it has to do with finances, people who are a little hesitant about the policy change are going to grab onto that and say, this happened because we did the fee reduction. So it's good to have some data for before and after the policy change, but really we see very, very little of this. And we even have adopters who are very low income who seem to take very, very good care of their pets. And there are resources in the community as well to assist them. So we have, they're not stuck if their pet gets sick and they can't afford a private clinic.
Thank you. Dr. Levy, do you have anything to say on the subject?
Yes, and we've actually done some research around this where we surveyed adopters who had acquired animals from both fee and fee-waived events, and we found no difference in income or the outcome of the animal, including whether it sleeps on the bed and lives indoors or whether they still had it. So I agree that the main benefit of the fee-waived adoption is to create excitement about a time-limited event that gets people into your shelter. Once people are in your shelter, if you've got nice animals, they'll walk out with one. But the challenge really is getting them to walk through the door. And there is something odd, at least about Americans, that they will do almost anything for something free. And if, for instance, if Taco Bell is giving away free tacos, there will be a line around the block for people to buy to get a 75-cent taco for free. So it just triggers something genetic in us to answer that call to urgency. So that's what I think is the best thing. Our veterinary students actually initiated the first free adoption-a-thon several years ago at our local shelter, and we did have staff especially who are very afraid of bad outcomes, and they've just turned out marvelous, and now the shelter staff is totally engaged with trying to come up with another excuse for a free adopt-a-thon every time they can.
Oh, that's great. Okay, good. Let's look at this next question. Can you talk about the 8.5% euthanasia for FIV? Do you currently only euthanize cats with serious complications from FIV, or do you euthanize most cats with FIV because of challenges placing them? What about kittens over 6 months who are FIV positive?
Okay. So FIV in the past at our shelter was an automatic euthanasia. So if a cat tested positive for FIV, they were euthanized. At this point in time, okay, wait, let me go back 1 second. If a cat tested positive for FIV, we would reach out to a very limited number of rescue transfer partners that we have who will occasionally take an FIV cat. These are typically 1 or 2 no-kill type shelters in our area that have a limited number of spaces for FIV cats. So if we had a really sweet, wonderful cat with FIV, we would try and get it to rescue. And we did successfully do that several times. I actually see some of those rescue partners on the attendees list, so thank you for the ones you take. We love you. For the rest, we did not put FIV positive cats up for adoption at our shelter. When our length of stay to adoption was 52 days for a healthy, wonderful cat, there was almost no way we would ever adopt out an FIV cat. It would just not have been possible back in the day. At this point in time, if we have a relatively healthy cat with FIV and it's super sweet, we will put it up for adoption. We've had a number of successes lately with that. We try and not have more than one FIV cat at a time in adoption because we only have 12 cages in adoption, and we don't want to fill it up with FIV and not have a place for our fast trackers. So we are doing that now. The ones who are sick, we will put to sleep. Also, if they are a feral cat and we are doing them as an SNR or a TNR and they test positive for FIV and we're testing them because they appear ill, those cats will be put to sleep and will not be returned to their location. That's currently our policy, and I know other shelters have other policies. I know one shelter that has kind of an FIV positive colony of cats that they can release FIV cats to as a relocation. We don't have that as a resource for us where we are right now. As far as kittens over 6 months who are FIV positive, same policy. So if it's a healthy kitten that tests positive for FIV, we would go ahead and put it up for adoption if we had the capacity to do that at our shelter at that time. So, but that's a big shift, and that's probably only within the past 6 months. You know, if you had asked me 2 years ago, what do you do with FIV cats, I would say absolutely they are put to sleep. So that's a shift, and it's a work in progress. Currently, FELV we do still euthanize for, just because those cats tend to be much more ill. But that's our current policy, and it's new and different, and it's working okay for us right now. And, you know, it's just because we've been so successful in all of these other programs that we can even consider doing that at a public animal shelter where the euthanasia rate used to be 70%. And thank you for the question, Sheila.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else before we go on to the next? Okay, so this is an interesting question, and I think we'll probably get several responses from it. Do you allow same-day adoptions?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. We pre-adopt, spay, neuter everything, and so at our shelter, an animal is evaluated and it's made an adoption candidate. It has surgery. It goes up for adoption. Person comes in, they want to adopt it, and they take that pet home. If we were at a shelter that didn't do pre-adoption spay neuter, then they could adopt but not take home until after the surgery was done. Or if we ever had some kind of a backlog on surgery, which we don't typically at our shelter, but if that was the case, they could adopt. We would keep the animal for the surgery, and then it would go home. We don't have any kind of a cooling off period on adoptions at our facility.
Okay, that was straightforward. Here's another one. What about letting your foster people adopt their foster pet?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I mean, we don't always want them to adopt and then not be able to foster anymore. But on the other hand, you know, it's a home for the animal, and most of them, if they're really good foster parents, will continue to foster for us. We personally don't have an issue with that, and we don't even call it a foster failure. We call it an adoption. That's all good in our book. Kelly, what's your personal opinion on that? Do you have any different thoughts?
No, I mean, of course, I feel a little sad if they stop fostering after adopting, but you know, you can't ask for a better home than someone who has come to an animal shelter asking to foster homeless animals and then falls in love with one. So I don't think there's any negative to it, really.
And with the kittens, we actually give the foster parents priority. So if they fall in love and they want to adopt their own kitten, they can. And we also use them as adoption ambassadors. And if they have friends or family members who fall in love, those people get first dibs on that animal, and it just comes back to the shelter for surgery, and then that person can adopt it. We want to get them in, get them out. We don't want to put any barriers up if we can help it.
Excellent. Okay, So this questioner says, at our shelter, a return earns an adopter do not adopt status. How do you handle that at your shelter?
We don't really do that. We will allow them to adopt again. We try and find out why they returned the animal, and we try and make sure that if they want to adopt again, that it's going to be a better match for them and their situation. Kelly, you want to talk to that? Because I know that you're the one who would handle that more so than I would.
Yeah, no, absolutely not. We try really hard to make sure that if an adopter feels they need to return an animal, that they don't feel judged. There's nothing wrong with them. We do an intake interview, try to figure out what went wrong. If they might want to keep the animal but just don't know how to deal with the problem, we try to offer them support and counseling to make that happen. But if not, they say, look, I did this. This is what I was looking for when I got the animal home. This is what I saw. Now we have a better idea both about that animal and about what the adopter wants, and we might be able to take them right out to the adoption area and point them to some other animals. So they can be quite wonderful adopters. There's no reason why a failed adoption should speak to their quality as a pet home, or how much they're going to love an adopted animal.
Here's a follow-up question for you, Dr. Delaney. What about letting foster people adopt their pet out to another person other than themselves? Do you let your fosters adopt their animals directly?
Yeah, we have moved towards this. Again, just a few years ago, we didn't even have a foster program, so it's not like we had some hard policy against this in the past. But as we started the program, like I say, we do give their friends, family, or somebody they may come across in their daily life, or that they've promoted their animal on Facebook, we give that person basically dibs on the animal. And as long as they aren't appearing to be a serial killer, they get to adopt the animal. We tend to have the paperwork done on site, just because for processing of paperwork that's easier. So with the kittens, the kitten would be in the foster home. They might arrange for somebody to adopt. The animal would come back. We would do the adoption processing, including surgery and microchip and all that fun stuff. And then the new adopter would come into the shelter just to do the paperwork and pick up their kitten. For the dogs, we have even moved to the point where if a dog is in foster because it's working on some kind of a fearful issue or some other minor behavioral, we'll even allow the adopter to do the adoption kind of off-site and just have the paperwork done at our place. So Kelly, can you talk to that? Because I know we've had people fostering dogs where they've met the adopter, to meet the dog either in a park or at their own home, and then the adoption paperwork, I believe, is still completed at the shelter. Am I getting that correct?
Actually, we've started now sending all the paperwork off-site. If the foster home is a volunteer who has been trained in adoptions, they can do it themselves, and I can't, obviously, they're at that point the best qualified to talk about the dog anyway. But if they're not comfortable or trained in doing an adoption, then we can send out a message to our off-site folks and say, can someone meet, this foster home at their home tomorrow at 5 p.m. and help process the paperwork if the adoption goes through. So everything can happen now off-site.
That's great. Good job, Kelly.
So having removed so many barriers, do you still have any criteria that disqualifies an adoption candidate at the moment, or do you work on a case-by-case basis?
It's really case-by-case. Kelly, can you think of some specific kind of deal breakers that would disqualify the adopter completely?
Well, if there's a serious concern for the safety of the animal or the person, I think that if someone tried to adopt who we had a history of neglect or abuse of an animal, that would be a pretty clear disqualification. But as long as there's not a safety concern, we may want to try to steer them toward a different animal possibly, but other than that, we just try to set them up for success as much as possible.
Okay, excellent. Here's the next question. Our shelter has no foster program for dogs. They say it is because if they are returned, there will be no space for them. Do you have a foster program for dogs?
We do have a foster program for dogs. It was started kind of secondary to the kitten program. The kitten program seemed to be the biggest need at the time, and it was really for the underage ones and the mildly sick and injured. And then we did start to branch out into some fostering of dogs, and it's kind of a two-part program. There's one part of it that's really just like a kennel break for the dog, just to get the dog out of the shelter for a day or two as a little stress reliever. So it's kind of a little shelter vacation. So they leave for a day or two, and then they come back and go back on the adoption floor. And then there's also another component of that program, which is for dogs who need a little bit longer fostering because there is some kind of an issue. They're fearful. They don't show well in the shelter. They have a behavioral concern that needs to be worked on. And those dogs may or may not come back. In some cases, ideally, they wouldn't come back, and our foster parents would work to adopt the dog out as an adoption ambassador out in the community, or they would go to our off-site adoption events and not return to the shelter itself. The way we manage our population at the shelter is that we always have some capacity. We don't ever work where every single cage in our shelter is full, knock on wood. So that would be a little bit less of an issue, but I would say that if you're at a facility where every cage is always full, adoption ambassadors is something to really look into, where the foster parents actively promote the dogs and get them adopted directly from their home, and or having them be in foster and then be taken to off-site type events so they're not taking up kennel space ever. They're just going from the foster home to the off-site and then back again. Kelly, do you have more to say about that?
No, not really. I mean, our foster program for dogs is pretty small right now. We only have a handful out at a time, and as Dr. Delaney said, there's always some space, so we don't really run into that problem, or at least we haven't yet.
Okay, thank you. We're going to take a couple more questions and then probably wrap up for the evening. Here's a good one. We rely heavily on vet references for our adopters. If they have an animal who didn't receive any care and passed away young, or from an issue that never got treatment, how do you address that? Do you deny the adoption?
Yeah, we're not really calling on vet references for our adopters at this point in time. If we had some kind of history, of abuse or neglect that we had documented and that it was very clear, then we would have to consider that before we would allow somebody to adopt. And that's really the only thing that I can think of, is if we knew for sure that they had really done something wrong. And there are cases where people have animals that are very sick and they can't afford to take care of them, or even if they had all the money in the world, the animal has something that's just not treatable. And so we'll periodically get an animal in that the person did take to a vet and then just said, I can't afford what you're recommending, and then the animal comes to us. And in some of those cases, those animals are really horrendously ill, and even getting a diagnosis to know that it's horrendously ill could cost hundreds or thousands of dollars. And I don't think that it's necessarily right to hold that against the person forever and not allow them to adopt an animal from you in the future. So in cases where really the person was just unlucky and had a very sick animal that they couldn't afford to provide the care for, I don't think that that would be a reason not to ever adopt. And even if we thought that, they could still just go and get an animal. So it's really case by case. And we really have to just be aware that you're not being too judgmental and too unrealistic about what's reasonable for the normal human being to be able to do for their pet. Because there are cases where, people only have so much money to spend on their animals, and some animals, the money that they would require is not reasonable. Kelly, do you have any thoughts, or Dr. Levy, do you have any thoughts on this?
It's something that we don't check vet references, but it's something that sometimes comes up in the adoption consultation. We ask, when was the last time you had a pet? What happened to them? And I try to look at it as an educational opportunity. Sometimes we're the first people to mention something like flea control or heartworm preventative. to a pet owner, and it's not because they're bad people or they didn't want to care for their animal, but just their upbringing and their background hasn't exposed them to that idea. And if we know already that, well, we had this sick animal, but we couldn't afford to go to the vet, we can talk to them right away up front about the resources that they have available to them in the community if their animal does get really sick and it's going to be something more than they can afford. What can they do to take care of their animal without having to relinquish it back to the shelter? So it's not always a terrible thing. It can be a conversation starter and a good point to kind of kick off the conversation about veterinary care to people that might not have thought much about it before.
I agree, and this topic brings up so many colliding issues. One is the escalating costs of veterinary care and how more and more lower and middle income people can't afford it anymore, and more pets are just not getting the veterinary care that they need, even routine preventive care, let alone emergency care for unexpected illnesses. So that's one aspect. Another aspect is that these families are going to get pets, and if we deny being a partner in their having an educated pet owner experience, then that pet that we don't know about that ends up in a home that doesn't know there needs to be veterinary care is worse off. So we haven't really helped animals in our community overall. And then hopefully our communities are developing more and more support networks to help pets stay in homes, programs like Pets for Life and food banks and care for unexpected illnesses and low-cost vaccination clinics. All of these go towards providing more preventive health care and emergency care to pets to keep them with their families.
Okay, thank you all. And here's the last question for the evening. Adopting is one thing, but how does one prevent an animal from coming back?
Well, I think that a lot of that is providing the animal with as much medical care as you can before you put it up for adoption so that you're sending people with the healthiest animal possible, or if you find a medical problem, disclosing it and giving the people as much information as possible. And I think a lot of it is about adoption counseling, although, again, I'll say that, some animals get almost no adoption counseling and do just great, but I think that the adoption counseling can be a big piece of the puzzle. So helping the people to understand how to introduce the animal to their home, what to expect, what care the animal needs, letting them know what resources are out there if they come across any issues, medical or behaviorally, as much as possible being a resource for them if that's something your agency can do, or giving them information on other resources if you really don't have the bandwidth to do that. And then if problems do arise, being there for them to try and support them in any issues that are arising. Kelly, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yes, I think it's hard to try to prevent returns on the front end. More important is the availability. So we're available by phone or email to any adopter who has a question or problem, and we can try to coach them through problems ourselves. If they're fairly simple, we can refer them to qualified professionals to assist if we can't help them. But just being there to talk about what's going on and give them suggestions. And sometimes the best suggestion is go ahead and bring the animal back. This sounds like it's not a good fit, but not always. A lot of times we can try to figure out a way to fix the situation so that they feel they're happy with their adoption.
Okay, very good. I'm going to ask Dr. Levy to do some closing remarks for us tonight. Dr. Levy, take it away.
Well, I'm very grateful at the warm response that we've had to this series of webcasts about the 5 initiatives that were developed to save 1 million cats in shelters over the next 5 years. The participation has been really quite remarkable, especially considering that it's been every week. And for those of us on the East Coast, pretty late, and yet you just kept coming and asking these really good operational questions about how shelters can be better serving their cat populations in their community. And we're hearing from those of you who are out there innovating and developing these new tactics, and those of you who are watching and getting excited about implementing them as well. We hope we will see all of the shelters that are online tonight as partners with us in the Million Cat Challenge. Please do go to our website and sign up, and we will count the lives that you save towards the million that we hope to collect in far less than 5 years.
Perhaps maybe even this year.
Well, that would be awesome.
I'm an optimist, yes. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Levy. So that's the end of our event tonight. We want to thank Dr. Delaney, Kelly, and Dr. Levy, and all of you for your time. We invite you to take a few minutes to complete our survey. Your feedback is important to us. Click on the link on your screen. If for some reason you don't see the link, it is also in the resource file at the bottom of your screen, and the link will be emailed to you in a few days. This webcast will be available on demand shortly, and we hope you will share this presentation on your social sites. We hope you can join us this Thursday, yes, the day after tomorrow, for a special webcast on the canine influenza outbreak with Dr. Sandra Newberry. Thanks again for being here with us this evening, and good night.